Matt Trappe, your first ever appearance on Second Nature, certainly not the last. You are now stuck with us. Welcome to Second Nature.
Welcome,
Yeah, thank
Trappy.
you. I'm like another level of second naturalist now.
You're in good company because you've got Steve Holmberg here. He has been on Second Nature like 100 times at this point, but we are always very happy to have him here. We've learned so much from his insights. Steve, welcome back.
Oh, thank you, Aaron. Good to be here.
So this is the 2025 predictions podcast. We are going to talk about everything from consumer to brand to product to industry and beyond. And we've all done a lot of work to kind of pull some stuff together. We're going to have a little bit of a lightning round at the end with some of the hot takes from our Slack crew. And I think this is going to be just a really awesome discussion because we all have kind of varying viewpoints on stuff. Looking through what you guys put together in our document here, there's some really interesting conversations to dig into. I think where we probably want to start, and Steve, you kind of talked about this, like where everything should start is with the consumer. So let's hear your first 2025 prediction from the perspective.
2025 predictions. Here we go. I think 2025 is going to be a really interesting year in terms of consumers and their engagement with sports. And what we've seen in 2024, I think is going to continue to prevail and only become stronger in 2025. And so my expectation and my prediction is that the energy for the sport and outdoors industry is really going to be driven in two polarized locations. One, high-end performance, and two, casual participation. And so what we've seen in the 2024 timeframe, and even back to 2023, is that there has been a general casualization of sports and outdoor activities. And so think of that as happening in two different ways. One, you're getting a lot of sort of new people that came in post-COVID that are entering into sports and they're participating and they're trying a bunch of different sports. So they may come in and try paddleboarding, or they may come in and try hiking a couple times a year, but not necessarily be the avid hiker that's hiking every week. And they may be playing multiple sports, which is great. The other thing I think that you're seeing that's ballooning this casual is you're seeing a lot of the performance. So a lot of people that are, let's say, participating really regularly, that once a week, they are now scaling back and they're sort of doing a little bit less of sport. And so you're seeing this casualization that's occurring throughout that consumer participation. So I expect that is only going to continue into 2025. I think there's a lot of reasons that are driving people to participate and to be part of the outdoors and to play sports, but you're losing a little bit of that energy that's in that middle core. But while I say that, I think what you're seeing is, as we've talked about on the podcast before, there is this push for innovation. And a lot of that innovation that's happening by these brands is helping athletes become better. And if I go back to Dylan's 3 C's of carbon, cooling, and carbs, I think that's a great example of what we're seeing in the running marketplace of a lot of athletes that are becoming faster and breaking records. I expect that top end to really continue to sort of push and break those records. So I think there's going to be a lot of excitement. You're going to see a lot of crossover of sports. So you're going to see a lot of road runners move to trail because there's an opportunity to win there and be great. You're going to see training intensify, etc. But as that continues to become better, like many sports, you think of, CrossFit did this, the more professional it gets, the less attainable it feels towards the middle, and can be a bit discouraging. So you're going to see some people be inspired by that, but you're going to see others that are be like, you know what, I am never going to be that. Like I can't compete in the same way that I used to. And so that they are sort of scaling back out of it. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that all plays out. And so I think, again, number one, I think we're going to see this polarization of high-end performance athletes and then this broadening of casual and more casual participation. What are your thoughts?
I have a couple right off the bat, Steve.
Yeah.
You talk about this casual athlete pulling back. I don't know that athlete came into the sport looking for performance, looking for innovation, and saying, oh, gee, I love, running, which is my wheelhouse, because there's all this innovation. I think those people came into the sport because they found other things that it gave them, like just from a social, emotional, and just wellness standpoint. And I don't know that I see them pulling out of the sport as it seemingly becomes more attainable at the top, which I agree with you. I think they're just looking for something else, and I think they're looking for brands that will deliver those other benefits to them that are outside of performance.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And that's going to lead me to my next one, but we'll
Mm-hmm.
get there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Does this feel like a bit of a fork in the road too of the category itself, where half the people split in the direction of optimizing performance and really digging in with more, wearable devices, trackers, data, just going super deep, and then super casual where they're more interested in maybe a different style of event like the run club, or like some of these less competitive events that are still like a fun way to experience the sport without. Do you feel like this is something that kind of splits it apart in a meaningful way?
I think there are now more reasons to participate than there ever have been before, right? Like I think it's helping with mental health. I think it's
Yeah.
helping engage people to others. I think of run clubs and how how it's become a dating, proposition for many people. I think that is happening, and that's dimensionalizing who is participating. But the interesting part about it is I think brands have an interesting choice that they're going to have to make.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's difficult to balance those two and come across authentically. And there's a lot of brands that are at that growth like inflection point where they're going to be trying to do that. But you see the niche brands that come in and it's easy for them to just mean one thing and run with it. And they hit wild success trying to do that.
You're building a small brand off of one of those two. And probably the only brands that can capitalize on both are going to be those big brands. So do they have access to sort of like a new lever that they might not have had?
Yeah, is there a way to reach? I mean, this might bleed into future things, we start talking about with athletes and content and things, but is there a way for them to reach that pinnacle of performance, but also speak authentically to the casual runner that just isn't particularly interested in that, and that's not why they're in the game, so to speak?
This specific point of how things are spreading out between athletes or performance and casual, there's a really big opportunity to speak directly to both categories. Like we were saying, that you're going to have brands that sort of narrow in on each one of those casual and performance sides. I think content creators could do the exact same thing. And one of my hot takes for this year, one of my predictions for next year, is that sort of the athlete only job is over, right? Like, unless you are the 0.01% best athlete who's winning almost everything, it is really difficult to be number 3, number 4 on the team, because the budgets of these brands are going to those top performers. The cost of living for athletes and all of us is going up. And so, can you actually make enough money to actually be a full-time athlete and not do anything other than race across all the different sports and outdoor? I think it's really difficult. And I think that athletes are going to have to figure out ways to supplement that. And I think content creation is likely one of the most popular ways to get there. You have to be able to provide value outside of the race course to these brands so that they can, really justify that spend, and so that you can find other kind of surface area to bring in money for your overall program.
All right, I'll jump in first. I completely agree. I think you're gonna have brands that find it more easy to justify the spend that they would have on that third, fourth tier athlete, or however you want to refer to them, on some influencer or some creator that doesn't have performance aspirations. But I think if you are this athlete with performance aspirations, not at the top of the sport necessarily, that can bring the consumer and the brand's lifestyle like closer to home for you and capture your daily life, your routine, your lifestyle as it relates to that brand story. I think that actually goes even farther then, because then you are racing, then you're kind of hitting a bit of both worlds. And I'd like to see a lot more of that. And I think we will. But I think like just creatively and from a technology, like creative production point of view, we have to get over some humps. But I think those are, from having my background, I think those are totally surmountable things that can happen with a little bit of work, a little bit of effort. And I would love to see the brands lead and help the athletes along in that way.
One thing I really want to see happen in 2025 are more partnerships between athletes and content creators specifically. So
Yeah.
probably one of the best examples out there is the partnership that Dylan and Ryan Thrower have, where Ryan is the camera who's at the events, who's obviously helping with the podcast as well, and this one. Thanks, Ryan. But also he's there creating, photos, creating custom video content, and really building out that offering of Free Trail. So it's not just a podcast, but there is actual content being delivered on top of that. And the partnership between a top tier athlete and a top tier content creator is sort of undefeated here in terms of your ability to reach beyond just, racing and that. So I wonder if, what would it look like if a top level content creator who really understood how everything comes together partnered up with Courtney Dauwalter? She'd be undefeated,
Exactly.
right? What would that look like if you paired any athlete up and gave them access to a content creator who knew their stuff and could really polish their stuff? We did a podcast a couple weeks ago with Stu Thompson, who runs Cut Media, and he partnered up with Danny McCaskill, who isn't a competitive athlete, but their creativity works well together. And if they were building a content empire together, they are unstoppable. And so what might that look like for competitive athletes to give them that extra edge for building even beyond now? And to your point, Matt, not just speaking on the performance side of things, but reaching sort of the entry point consumer, reaching the casual runners and cyclists and stuff like that. There's a big opportunity for those partnerships.
I think there's two ways to go about that, and one is sort of the more behind the scenes person, like Ryan is with Dylan. I think if you were a brand and you had that person in house to work with your athlete team in Ryan's regard, I think that's a really effective way to do it that I'd like to see. But I also think on camera, what if you had a creator personality paired with an athlete and they just kind of played off of each other on camera in some sort of YouTube series? I think that would be really, really engaging, really fun to watch, and bring in sort of a Venn diagram of audiences to their channel. And I think those are kind of two different strategies to go about it. That'd be really fun.
Yeah, I think we got a Galaxy brand brewing here.
Yeah, I'd love to push this to the sort of the brand side into my next prediction, which is the idea that I think small brands will get this and small brands will understand this, but I think big brands are going to miss it. I think they are going to go back to performance. They're going to focus on performance. But I'm not sure that they're going to see that the game has changed since when they were last sort of focused on performance. So as much as they go back to that athlete and back to that winning mentality or top of mountain mentality, they're going to fail to connect with consumers. And they're not going to necessarily see that idea that you all are talking about, which is this isn't about the peak, right? Like this isn't about being on the podium. This is about the mid-mountain, I will call it, where people are looking to become incrementally better, or they're looking more closely for that inspiration and aspiration that they're going to kind of miss. And I think the big brands, again, that might not hit. I don't know if you watched the Under Armour Investor Day. Plank did talk about, we want to go back to what we were, but the consumer has changed, and so we need to change, which I really liked. But I also heard, Nike's investor call where Elliot Hill and everybody's talking about, hey, what we're hearing from employees is we want to go back to the old Nike and we want to go back to sport, which I totally agree with. I think we just need to be cautious that the consumer has changed, right? Like we can't go back and market to the 2020 consumer. We need to see the consumer and now look at what sport is to that consumer now. And then how do we play in that world?
It's frustrating as a content creator who has the data to show that, hey, this is working. We are connecting with people that are buying your stuff. It's really frustrating to have that data, but then not be able to get that across the line with brands. Like brands not getting it there's nothing we can do from our side other than share the data and show this, like, this is consistently working really well. I don't know how to get that point across. And I think probably a lot of brands are going to take a giant L as they struggle to figure it out. But I guess maybe that's a future post 25 prediction that brands one day will get it, that there's a new channel, a new lever to pull when it comes to reaching out to consumers that maybe they don't have 100% control over, but they can be influential if they make meaningful partnerships with creators who have the attention of the consumers. And, like Instagram took a long time to get established. It wasn't immediately obvious that, hey, we should start advertising on Instagram. It was not an immediate thing. It took a long time for that to set. And so maybe my optimistic approach to why content creation is so important is still a bit ahead of its time.
Yeah, totally. And I think it used to be the case where big brands would set the direction, and everybody would steal the smaller brands would steal the playbooks from the big brands. We've seen those smaller brands actually create the playbook, and now bigger brands are going to try to start to steal those small brand playbooks. So how do you be a big brand but act small is going to be the challenge of these brands for 2025.
I have a question for you guys along those lines. It's a bit philosophical. Like, things are moving so quickly right now, and I think that's why you see the small brands, like, just with their agility, be able to be so successful, just like you said, Steve, and the big brands are sort of following them. Is this whole playbook mentality, does that make any sense anymore with the speed that things are moving? Or do you just have to be creative and figure things out based on what is happening and what you think is happening? Like, can you revert to something that worked a few years ago, especially when you're a big brand and it might take that amount of time to get it going? And does that work anymore? Or is the speed just too quick?
It's hard. I mean, you're looking at a product creation process that can take up to 2 years long in order to sort of fulfill and solve, and marketing can fill the gap. But I think, if you look at On, they picked up Zendaya, right? Like they've got this amazing personality to be part of that brand, but they still need 2 years to sort of follow with product. So they can bring in all the marketing they want, but until you get that product connection, that can be really hard. And so I think it's a really interesting question of are you a leader or are you a follower? And I think you need to play both. I think, like all good teams, you need to play offense and defense, but you've got to pick where you're playing offense, and you have to constantly read for a defense. Again, I go back to Nike. Back in the day when Under Armour came around, it was like, oh, hold on, like we've got this new brand that's connecting with young men and women, and like that is potentially a threat. At the same time, Under Armour got men to wear spandex and created a very large business for Nike, right? Like if you're able to follow quickly and accurately. So I think it's on everybody to not only set that direction, but be able to read and respond in more real time in order to stay current with everybody.
This reminds me of one of the things that Sharky sent over, because I asked him to send over a few predictions, and one of his was that we'll see more cottage industry surf brands emerge after losing so many giants to mergers and licensing deals. And going back to Matt's point about the playbook, as what is the playbook for some of these brands? Some of these brands that got swooped up in mergers and licensing deals are now focused on volume, and some of the cottage industry brands, and I think this extends beyond his point about surf, but I think a lot of these challengers that are starting up and getting going are a lot more focused on quality performance, really connecting with a specific kind of consumer instead of trying to be all things to all people. And I think probably to just continue on Matt's point is Sharky's point that Matt, that, like you have to be specific. You have to connect with people. You can't be all things to all people and be successful anymore. The playbook has to be more specific. It can't be broad. It can't be volume based. And that's where probably the giants are going to struggle the most. Mm-hmm. Okay. We're moving a little slow through this list.
I'm loving the conversation though.
Yeah. I mean, I think we sort of touched on this a little bit, but Steve, you had a point about how big brands are going to struggle and small brands are going to gain market share. Is there anything else that you wanted to say? I know we've kind of talked a little bit about this already, but
what I would just add to that is I think when we specifically now start to talk about outdoor, I think the slow decline that we're seeing in Gorpcore and a little bit sort of this shift, I'm going to call it trade score. I haven't heard a name for it, but I see at least like a lot of my students and people out there in the industry now sort of wearing Carhartt double kneed pants, that sort of baggier, looser look, but it sort of sits more in the trade zone than it does the Gorpcore, is going to create a right sizing of the business again, of back to who is the actual consumer of this product rather than necessarily playing in that fashion trend. So while we might have a little bit of a hard time for some of those, especially bigger brands during this time, I do think it's a right sizing. It's not a bad thing for the industry, but I think it's going to create some challenges in 2025.
Do you see that coming out of small brands in the industry, or do you think the bigger brands kind of latch onto that first?
I think some of the smaller brands are doing things different enough that they're able to sort of carve out their niche. I think of Hiker Kind being a really interesting one in that space, where it has a different aesthetic, it has a different look, and you can still play in that sort of core, but it doesn't feel like it's the like Arc'teryx jacket or the North Face jacket. It is new niche enough that it can work pretty well for them. So I do see those smaller brands sort of living nicely in that space, because that's always sort of somewhat resonated. It's the bigger brands that really made that transition over to culture than necessarily the small brands.
This is sort of a continuation of this, and maybe something we haven't talked about much, but what does merger and acquisition look like in the outdoor industry when there's no way that Nike can be that nimble on some of this stuff, but they could probably pick up, that hiker brand or whatever, or, do they try to swoop Satisfy or Normal or something like that? Like, what does the future of mergers and acquisition in the outdoor industry look like in the coming year?
From my perspective, the question that you're asking to me is, are you a house of brands or are you a branded house? And the idea here is, do you want to own a lot of different brands in order to be something? And so if we look at the brands that are that at the moment, and VF being a good one that owns North Face and Vans, etc., those brands are having a hard time at the moment. Like, I don't know if that playbook is actually seems to be working in the current environment. It may work, it may be great, but we're not seeing a lot of success that's there. Where the individual brands continue to do somewhat decently, which is good. When I look at the landscape, you look at who has the cash, and some of those bigger brands like Nike have a fair amount of cash that they can invest, but the small brands don't. And so will there be some M&A that happens? I think there will be some M&A. I think people are predicting a lot is going to happen. What I expect is actually going to happen more is, I think you're going to see a lot of almost divestitures. And so you're going to see more brands that are sort of moving out of PE, going public, or people are going to look for liquidation events to be able to cash out, especially under the new administration. In a time of sort of a general health of the industry, and so you are going to see more of, actually, I think, of, instead of the M&A, more divesting and more of the IPOs, etc.
I feel like the downstream effect of that is actually going to be sort of a nightmare for retailers, where they had, one account with a house of brands, and now they got to have like 10 different accounts. What does retail look like in 2025? Any hot predictions on this one?
So I continue to believe that the brick and mortar is going to kind of continue to struggle. I think it's still finding its place and niche of what and why we are here. And there's good reason to be here. Like, I love brick and mortar retail. We just need a lot more people to like brick and mortar retail. Where I think who will continue to sort of do well, but actually I think gain some ground, especially in 2025, is DTC online. So not necessarily, again, brick and mortar, but I think when you look at places like Satisfy or Bandit, or like, people are going to go to those brands, those niches in terms of where they're located, and they're going to start pulling directly from them. I think the other place that we're going to see some ground gained is really around resale. And so I think resale is the new sustainability that everybody is going to play in, because I think sustainability is a hard one for consumers to manage in an inflationary environment. People have a hard time sort of covering current costs, and honestly, sustainable products are currently a luxury, when you can sort of find them cheaper, find them at a better price, and people aren't sort of really willing to go there on new product. That being said, they still want that brand, and so they're going to try to find it in that resale environment. And so I think 2025 is going to be a good year for resale, especially for the outdoor industry.
We hit a few things in a row really quickly there, and I guess I'm not ready to jump to sustainability, although I have things to say on that. I think going back to I'll skip over the M&A conversation and go right to the retail conversation. I think you see specialty retail having to play less and less of a transactional function, because that's just slowly getting eaten up by D2C, and brands are happy to have that, and it will continue to grow. And so I think you'll really see a split even more, again, like just continuing with trends, right, in 2025 that we've seen already. I think you see some run specialty stores specifically that do a great job with community and with creating their own meaning and their own brand, do really well. And I think you see the ones sort of under the old model that are more transactional or maybe even just customer service oriented, kind of get swallowed up by the D2C push by brands. So I expect to see that just continue this year and into 2026. And then I think 2026 is where things start to change a bit more, just looking further ahead. But yeah, that's retail for me this next year.
I think one of the things, and you guys were both at TRE this year, but one of the pieces of feedback that I heard from the smaller brands that were sort of debuting at TRE was that the retailers were really excited about what they were doing, but the investment that the retailers would have to then make to bring them in, they're sort of essentially gambling, right? On like, is this going to be around? Is everything going to come through? And so the retailers are in a pretty difficult spot when it comes to actually managing inventory, especially from these smaller brands, not knowing if they're going to be able to get their full order or be able to keep it on the shelves. What do you think retail needs to do, though? I mean, I do think there's something that we're seeing in the trends that people want to be doing more in-person stuff. Run clubs are obviously huge. There's been a lot of discussion around that. But what do retailers need to do to make it through 2025, and how do they evolve?
I think they just embed themselves even more in their community and become even more of it's sort of a buzzword now, a community hub. But by that, I don't mean the place to have a run from. By that, I mean they truly are a part of the community, helping people and parts of their community outside of running that don't have anything to do with running. I think embedding yourself really closely with the community outside of the sport is the way to really become a focal point that has a lot more brand power and staying power, and can command the prices that retail will need to stay in business.
Yeah, Trappe, I really like how you describe that, because I think it can easily get lost, the idea of community, and community sometimes feels, if I was a retailer and I heard it's about community and sort of that connection to community, I would feel like I'd have to create community. And the reality is it creating community is, one, really hard, and two, there's an inauthenticity in creating community. It does not that you can't do it. Some brands have done a great job doing it. But if you can prop up community,
correct,
that is where I think you're going to shine, right? Like you are the supporter of the community that already exists.
Correct.
That's where the power lies. And I think that's sometimes the nuance that gets missed by some of these retailers.
What's interesting that sort of popped into my head now too, when you talk about community, people that are really good at creating community are content creators. And just like we talked about, premier athletes partnering with content creators, brands partnering with content creators, what does that look like to have a content creator partnered with a retail location and utilizing that as a space that shows up in their content, creating events based off of that specific space and really localizing, regionalizing some of that stuff? And I think there's a lot of value to the content creator as well, A, to have sort of a home base, B, also, a lot of brands are looking for in-person events, ways that they can activate that athlete with events, and having a specific retailer to be supporting. There's a really interesting sort of Venn diagram here where retail could be in the middle of that partnership in a pretty meaningful way. I don't know. I don't know if that's really been explored much yet, but I'd love to see that as a way to just enhance and draw, create that retail space as sort of like a mecca, like, oh, we got to go to this place. I've seen so many videos where it keeps showing up and I know everybody that works there. I think that's one of the most interesting things about content creation. You get to know the people, whether it's listening to somebody on a podcast or watching their videos. You get a really good sense of who that person is and how they think about stuff. And it's awesome to get a chance to meet that person or see that place. And I think retail could benefit pretty substantially from a meaningful relationship with a localized content creator. So maybe there's something there to explore.
Do you think we see the beginnings of hyper local content creators coming about? And I say that because I talk to a lot of brands and they have their specific markets maybe they're targeting that they've determined for their products, are real hubs of an audience they want to speak to. And the first thing they talk about is working closely with that retail store that they see as the hub of the community. Maybe if there is a content creator that can also fill that need, that's something that could really, really come about and grow. But I don't know that we see that yet. I don't know that there's enough of a market for that to support someone really taking that angle. Maybe in like New York City or something, right? Like really big markets.
Yeah,
I mean,
LA.
It really just
right,
depends.
right.
It just comes down to, I think, storytelling though too. Like if you've got a good content creator that can spin a good story, like you could do that anywhere. It doesn't necessarily need to be. I mean, the amount of content that I've made in the parking lot of the trails by my house, or in like a little random warehouse in Oregon City, like it's just, I think it's not location specific in a lot of ways, but does the retailer understand how to leverage that? Because for me, I had an online partnership up until recently with a online bike shop because I believe that my stuff all exists digitally because I reach people from all over the country and all over the world.
Yeah.
But it might actually be more valuable for me to partner locally so that I have sort of a place where if I did want to hold a movie premiere or I did want to get everybody together for a ride, there's actually a lot of upside for me in having a local partner too here in Portland that maybe I wouldn't be able to get that same level of value from that online partner. So I don't know. It hasn't really been done in a lot of content that I've seen so far, but I feel like maybe it's not a 2025 prediction, but it's like an idea for 2025 that could be explored. And maybe it becomes a trend in 26. Who knows?
Yeah. There's one, I guess, real quick thing, and then maybe we move on. I see run specialty stores, and this happens in cycling too. They start to offer coffee and ways to really get people coming in and out of the store. I mean, what if there were a small podcast studio or something that were for use by creators to just get traffic into the store and really integrate themselves in that conversation? Yeah, it's an idea.
Love it.
That'd be really cool. So we touched on sustainability, and Trappe, I know you had something on this as well in your list. I think sustainability to me is a sustainable product is one that you're not going to throw away. Like it's not about the material. It's not about anything other than just like you're not ever going to get rid of that thing, whether it's packaging, whether it's the product itself. That's sort of my hot take on sustainability, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it too.
Steve hit on it a bit before, but I think there's two angles right into sustainability. There's the real durability angle, but then there's also the really more consumable, recyclable angle. And you see some products that maybe don't last long, but they're highly recyclable. And there's sort of two trains of thought. I agree with Steve in that I think that the durability angle starts to be seen as luxury and then starts to really play into the resale market for where people have, maybe lower price entry points to it into those products to show their just sustainability goals for themselves, but also, maybe be seen as wearing more luxury products. But I think there's also a really strong place and market for those more quickly recyclable, quickly resumable, or recyclable products. And I think that's the two ways we start to see it go this next year.
Yeah, what I love about the resale side of things is it allows premium brands to remain premium. They don't need to create a good, better, best sort of hierarchy. They can stay in that best level and then use the resale as your price point, but it's still the same quality as the top, right? And so if you're a smaller brand and you're building this for the first time, it seems like such an opportunity. I do want to build on the idea though, too, as much as I've talked about resale and that will do well, I do continue to think that sustainability is going to languish in 2025. So in my perspective, at least in terms of what I've seen, sustainability as a movement continues to want to build and become the big hot topic. And I think, during COVID, they tried to make that a little bit of the story, and it ended up being COVID's the story. Mm-hmm. And then it was returning to a new normal. And there continues to want to this push to be the top of the story that everyone's talking about and top of mind for everybody. Mm-hmm. And I think in 2025, with a new administration, I think we may see going back sort of 4 years to the idea of the threat of public lands due to oil production. Yeah. And I think that will likely be the thing that bubbles up with consumers again. And what you'll see is that industry sort of re-rally behind that public access to those public lands and protecting public lands. And I think sustainability is going to continue to take that sort of backseat as that number one story of the industry. And I hope it doesn't. I want sustainability to be there. I want DE&I to be there. Like, I want diversity. But I think if I was to look at what's the rally cry in 2025, I think it's going to be around public lands again.
Steve, I agree. I think there's going to be a lot of oxygen eaten up by those threats, not just to public lands, but to rights for LGBTQ groups, to immigrant groups. And I think that's I think it's just going to eat up a lot of our energy trying to fight for that. And it sucks because a lot of these things we're really excited about. Yeah. You're right. Well, just for purposes of just our brain's bandwidth, have to take a back seat.
It's interesting to think about too. The other, things that are being talked about right now with the incoming administration is the whole tariff issue, and where does most of the outdoor apparel come from? It already is, on life support and has razor thin margins, and now you're going to add another 10% to that. I think what that ends up doing is obviously making life extremely difficult for a lot of these brands, but it also, going back to our discussion about resale, makes resale all that more important, where you're not going to be able to buy the newest bike. You're not going to be able to buy the newest gear. It's just going to be so priced out because you have to balance out the tariffs and everything else, that resale becomes even more important and necessary, which obviously if people are just selling stuff back and forth and the brands aren't involved in that transaction, just going to compound the problem. So there was a book that I read actually during the pandemic called Post Corona. And one of the points that they made in that book was that this phase was essentially advancing everything 5 years, where if your brand was going to exist in 5 years, it was probably thriving. If your brand wasn't going to make it 5 more years, it was probably dead now. And you've seen two things happen in the last week. GT bicycles actually paused completely, everybody's gone. Or maybe not everybody, but they're selling out of their remaining inventory. The athletes don't have contracts anymore. Things are not looking great. And Rocky Mountain just filed to restructure and protection from bankruptcy. So you're already seeing the inklings of what this might look like. And, brands were already not in a healthy spot going into this whole thing. I think that resale is going to be, a bigger topic in 2025 as a result.
Yeah. The idea that consumers really, they want a voice, and they're going to look to brands to be that voice. If the political system isn't being that voice, they're going to look to brands to be there. And I want to bring it back to tariffs, because I think tariffs is going to consume a lot of the brand's political power, especially in 2025. They're going to be like, if I was investing in lobbying efforts, it is going to be against tariffs currently, and not necessarily either protection of the outdoors or conservation or sustainability. I think, I like, Matt, I like how you talked about it. It takes the oxygen out. I think tariffs is the threat to the idea of that, of brands are going to have to protect themselves first through tariffs before they're able to help everybody else, which is going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Do you think that's a conversation in 2025 that becomes a real problem in 2026? Or do you think we see the tariffs become a legitimate problem this next year? Or do we not see them at all? I mean, that's what
I don't know, to be honest. It's going to be really interesting
the timing,
to see.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of at least in the bike brands, they already have their inventory that they're still trying to sell through. I mean, you can get a smoking deal on a bike right now because brands are just trying to jettison as much inventory as possible. And it's very possible that they could still be doing that in 2025. It's really anybody's guess. But yeah, from the outside, I'm sort of scratching my head of how does this shake out and who's going to make it through? Because it's not a guaranteed bet at this point.
Yeah, and it's really hard as a brand at the moment because you're expecting this. A lot of brands are sitting on a ton of inventory. Bike's not the only one. You look at a bunch of the sports apparel brands, they have a ton of inventory that they're trying to move through promotion, and so you're trying to clear out that inventory, but you're looking at tariffs come, and you're like, all right, how much can I pull forward before those tariffs actually hit and get them landed? And so you're like, am I going to pull forward at the same time? And how am I going to navigate that? And then what's that going to look like for the consumer post? Brands are in a tough spot trying to figure out how to navigate this. And I think some brands are diving in and other brands are like, I'm just going to wait to see what happens until it plays out. There's not much I can do.
Yeah. on that resale market, I think if I'm the brands, I'm really watching my products on that resale market, because if they're doing really well and they command a good price and they're durable and all of that, I don't want all of the benefits of that sitting on Poshmark or whatever, sitting on eBay or sitting on some other site. What if they're on my site right next to my new products, and you see the price they're commanding used? Like, what assurance for the buyer to buy a new product if they see it's basically an investment for them. That is a way I'm looking to capture that if I'm a brand, and resale really takes off through all this economic environment that we're talking about.
And it's also great to see what is interesting to the consumer. Like, what is consumers sending back to you in mass?
Yes.
And then what are people buying on the resale market in mass? And can that be all of a sudden your sportswear line, right? Or pick the style that you're going to go retro on, that you're going to do a collab with, could be your resale opportunity, is what you're seeing in resale. It's a great opportunity for brands.
Interesting. We had a podcast a couple weeks ago with the CEO of Sendy, which is how you sort of buy and sell used gear from the outdoor industry, which that's an interesting thought to see, like, what would it look like to have them sort of bolt on, sort of partner with the brand itself. And that kind of leads me to one of Matt Sharkey's other predictions in 2025, which I'll share with you now. And this is going to help us get to that content and athlete side, I think, a little bit easier. He said, recognizing how challenging it is for brands to build full competency agencies in-house, 2025 is a banner year for consultants and small agencies, for emerging brands looking to grow, and similarly for mid to specialty agencies for companies trying to grow even bigger. So this idea of, you used to have this like branded content studio that was in-house, pretty challenging to hold on to those, but there's a lot of people out there that have kind of spun out or who are starting to create content for brands specifically, and how you might be able to sort of build and grow that business specifically. Any thoughts on what it looks like to work with brands and create content on their behalf?
I have a lot of thoughts there. I think Sharky's talking about small, right? We'll run 1 to 20 million. I think you're going to have to partner with agencies, people, whoever on the content creation side that really know their niche market. And that's very, very specific. And so, like he said, consultants or small specialty agencies, I think, have a real way to play there that would be really effective. I agree. But I also think that a lot of the content, like we're talking about where this is moving, and a lot of it's YouTube, a lot of it's series. They don't necessarily have to be highly produced. I think this is, I don't see why you're not capable of doing this in-house. I think if you have the focus, I don't think it takes an enormous budget. I think it just takes someone who's focused on it, and the athlete conversation, like you said, Lutzi. I think if that's all integrated really well, I think to some degree you can do this in-house.
This is one of my predictions for next year, that someone's going to try to solve what I call the last mile problem. So in retail, or specifically, let's talk about Amazon. The last mile problem is what they actually solve, because there is a warehouse and there were people that wanted it, but the last mile of getting it from the warehouse to the people's doorstep was the problem. Yeah. And when you have this brand and athlete situation, you have the brand that's making this stuff and trying to get their athletes to post about it, to talk about it, to increase the brand love and get visibility out there. But the athletes, their goals aren't the same necessarily as the brand. They're still trying to focus on competition. They're still trying to put out viral content. They're trying to keep their boat afloat. And I think there's an opportunity for either an agency or a role at a brand that has a big enough athlete roster to make this make sense, where you could essentially close that gap and help the athletes with their production output, posting, everything like that. This is something that I hear consistently from agents and athletes specifically, of like, I just can't keep up with all these requests. I can't, I got to schedule all these posts that have nothing to do with what I'm actually, trying to get done on a week in, week out basis. I think if someone can come in and figure out how to put those two things together in a way that's actually meaningful and doesn't feel like, oh, I just copy pasted whatever launch video they have, I think figuring that out will be the true key for unlocking the entire athlete roster and opening up opportunities for more athletes, specifically when it comes to relationship with the brands.
It goes back to what we talked about earlier in the conversation. I think if I'm the brand, I'm really building out my athlete team from a creator, from a personality point of view. I want to see into their lifestyle. Maybe I'm linking them up with products that really fit them specifically. I'm going to create series that are recurring on my channels that involve those athletes. Maybe not even on my channels, maybe on the athletes' channels. I mean, that just adds a layer of authenticity. And I don't know if it's necessarily an outside agency that's doing this, or one or two people in house that are doing this, but I think the role and the function of that is becoming very, very clearly needed.
Absolutely.
I'm happy to add too, and taking it out of necessarily the creative industry, but just other consultants in the industry and how that's playing, is that I think for those smaller brands, the access to that knowledge or that capability has never been better. And so I think they're tapping into that expertise in order to have it, but not have to pay a full-time employee for it, right? Full-time employees are really expensive to keep busy. They consume time, they consume budget, etc., and allows them to bring it in and be able to execute that. I think the other thing that I see in 2025 too is, in order to have that, you need a team that understands that are full-time employees. What is the expectation and how do you actually know all of those functions? And so I do think there's going to be this push for sort of corporate trainings on things like sports marketing, on consumer research, et cetera, so that people are able to verbalize or have a common language for all of it, and are able to effectively brief those people that they're bringing in order to be able to deliver that. And so I think you're going to see this education that's happening within employees, but I think you're going to continue to see these smaller agencies there to support that are providing capabilities that typically small brands didn't have access to, which is kind of fun.
Maybe a bit of an intro to that, to teams. You know how you've seen athlete teams over the years that have maybe a real veteran athlete that's sort of that leader of the team. Maybe there's a creator that becomes involved that is sort of a leader in that way, from that angle, to start to set the tone and really just start to integrate the mindset and some of these conversations, some of the, the lingo like you're talking about, Steve, into the normal vernacular of their meetings and their daily business.
I think there's about to be a lot of experts when it comes to content that are going to be appearing on the job market very soon, because TikTok is about to be a wrap. It does not look good for the future of TikTok, and it probably in the next couple months is completely dead, at least in America, which means that a lot of people who were making a decent living off of this is not just like athletes, but just in general, there are people who are really good at capturing attention and keeping attention on social media who are not going to have an outlet. And maybe they were smart enough to build up a Instagram following with the same content, because you could absolutely copy paste content in both places. Not that it always performed the same in both, speaking from experience, but I think there are a lot of people who are going to be like, well, now what? And they have a lot of knowledge, experience to share, but they're going to need to have an income. And so whether they're consultants or whether they take jobs at brands, which will definitely flow downstream to the outdoor industry, I think there's an opportunity coming from this sort of end of an era with TikTok. And, do they flood into the other places, make it more competitive? Do they start over? What happens there? I mean, this is not the first time a social media platform has completely shut down. Vine, probably one of the more recent ones that had a big audience of people, and some people from Vine did become successful YouTubers. Jake Paul, one of them, right? But also a lot of people just gave up after Vine went away. So I don't know.
It's going to be interesting to see who comes across it too, because also it's like, which consumers were on X, right? Like they end up being older consumers that are consuming more news type situation or opinions, but it's not necessarily the younger consumer that was there. So who comes across that's able to resonate in those younger, and does it shift? Does Instagram automatically become older as X moves into Instagram, let's say, and it pushes all the younger to, let's say, Snapchat? And so I think that's a dynamic. But I would also add, I think with all of the tools in order to create content have never been easier to use. And it's never been easier for somebody to start a channel than it is now with AI, with all of the software and the programs. So I think not only you're going to get experts that are coming across from X, but you're also going to get this influx of people just that have access, that that barrier has been removed. And now they're sort of plugging in. I think there's going to be a lot of information. It's going to be harder and harder to cut through, but still possible.
You got to imagine the conversations that are happening at X, at Snapchat, at Instagram, thinking like, okay, there's about to be a giant influx. Can we capture and build an entirely new thing? We can't buy those users, but we can incentivize them by making it monetization easy. Like, hey, like imagine, like when you have a frequent flyer program, like, hey, I've got platinum status on data, but I'm going to start flying United a lot. You go over there and you're like, hey, here's my proof that I had platinum status. Give me platinum status on yours. And if I fly a certain amount of miles, I'm automatically bumped up for the year. Could somebody offer up the frequent flyer status match, but to X, to Instagram, to YouTube, whatever? There's a free idea.
Yeah, it reminds me of what LinkedIn's doing at the moment, where they are pushing content really hard for video and shorts, which is a totally different space from where they've been playing. But they're using their algorithm to automatically do that for everybody that comes over, like automatically that they get better viewership than sort of those that are sharing news articles, which take you off platform. Those have been sort of pulled back where the video content is being pushed, which I think is honestly a direct response to everything that's happening to push those creators to be more successful more quickly.
Yeah. One of the places that creators, it's an absolute hotbed, is LA. So one of my big predictions for 2025 is that Olympic marketing starts now. This year, the Olympics were absolutely massive. Paris set the bar crazy high, but LA is going to go for it. And I think, you saw the Tom Cruise, kind of launch video. I think they're really serious. And I think there's a lot of talent that's going to jump in and try to become relevant in this space so that they can sort of start working with all of the brands, all the studios, all the resources in LA. I think LA throws everything at it. And I think every brand that's engaged with the Olympics on some level is going to throw everything they've got at this moment. And if you're not in conversations about the Olympics in 2025, I think you're probably missing the boat from a brand perspective, from a creator perspective, from, I don't know, any.
You got to get through World Cup though. I think World Cup's going to be in 2026, like another moment. So to put that all together, maybe it's just sport is going to become huge over the next three years. It's going to be in the US, it's going to sort of go off, which will be interesting.
It's going to feel like we're super, super engaged when really it's just this sort of red herring of two big events happening. So let's not get over our skis like we did during the last big rush on the outdoor industry. I think people will be wise to be paying attention to that, because surely with all this talk of the World Cup and of the Olympics, there's going to be a lot of people that are getting into the sports. There's going to be a lot of people casually checking them out, but will they stick around like they, a couple of years ago?
I know that's always it's so interesting looking at that. And it always feels like there's a bump after sort of major tournaments and all that kind of stuff that occur for like a couple weeks afterwards of kind of some interesting random sports. And then it kind of goes back to the steady state. Right. And I think you see some sort of uptick that sort of happens in soccer, I think, for the World Cup and Women's World Cup. And there's a bunch of public information on that, but it's always can we translate professional sports into driving sport participation, which will then actually drive the business, is a huge challenge.
Yeah. Okay. How about a little bit of a lightning round through some of the hot takes from the Slack channel? So we sent a message out in the Second Nature Slack. The community responded en masse, which is exciting. I have, I think, 7 different hot takes that I selected here from our crew. And we don't have to go deep on all of them because we're already running a little long, but I'm actually really just excited to have this conversation in general, because I think it's just sort of interesting to share our thoughts and where we think it's all going. I think overall, like our outlook is, I think in most cases, like things are going to be interesting, but it's not all bad news. There's some pretty exciting stuff that's going to kind of unfold in general. And hopefully you guys share that same appraisal of the situation. But let's dive in. And if you have a couple comments on each one or something, we can go through that, but I'll try to keep this one kind of moving along.
Rapid fire.
Let's go.
Go.
All right. Lightning round. We're going to start off. Tony with the Sony says, run crews are still in. Satisfy shoe is the pinnacle of trail running shoe fashion, although its practicality becomes a divisive debate. New challenger brands start from gear versus shoe or apparel and rise. Access to parks gets threatened, and some races worry about their 2026 events. UTMP gets backlash for something. Again, people go, and it's still awesome. Western States is going to have record heat, temperature-wise and competition-wise. They're all very running specific, but hey, that's his space. Thoughts, comments?
I completely agree with a lot. Hi, Tony. Shout out, Tony. I think the Satisfy shoe is interesting because it's a shoe that and I've seen it in person. It's beautiful and it's really well thought through. But I think it also comes with a lot of brand meaning behind it. And so I'm interested to see if that opens up more area for other brands to come at footwear from a real branding angle versus a technology innovation angle. So I want to see how well that takes hold. Also interesting because it's at more of a regular price point compared to other footwear versus all of other Satisfy's products. I think so it fits in more on the shoe wall. So I just want to see how all that plays out. I'll be watching that very closely. Yeah, UTMB will do something. I agree with him there, but people will still go. It's still awesome and beautiful. And Western States is going to be an absolute track meet. I think it's going to be a throwback to the Unbreakable days. Being very into trail running, I can't wait to see how that shakes out. And if weather is the wild card, then anyone could win, including someone out of absolutely nowhere like we saw at UTMB this last year. So let's see what happens.
All right, next one I've got. John Adams says, here's a prediction based on the insights from Nike's earning call. Elliott Hill turns the ship and it either all blows up, less likely, or number two, in a year or two, they're making major moves against upstart brands or acquiring some of those brands. Let's call it the incumbents strike back. All right, Nike alum, what do you got?
Yeah, looking at you, Steve.
Yeah, okay. Happy to take this. Elliott's turn, good earnings call. I think what was interesting, just to bring everybody up to speed, if you haven't heard, Nike reported their earnings. They did better than Wall Street's expectations. That being said, their top line was down 7 to 8%, and their bottom line was down 26%. So still declining, but better than Wall Street was expecting. So I think this year is going to be hopefully the bottoming out of that ship of somehow. And so I expect to see a lot of push there. And let me tell you, Nike's going to do everything it can to make that not happen. So even if we don't see sort of the end result yet, that seems like a more 2026 prediction. You're going to see a lot coming down the pipeline. And so you'll see that before anything else. In terms of acquisitions, I don't know. I'm honestly a little skeptical. Again, I go back to what we talked about earlier. Are you a house of brands or a branded house? And a house of brands it doesn't seem like the winning play currently, but that would be my cautionary tale.
And Nike has done some acquisition, but
absolutely,
I don't know. Are there any success stories from that?
I mean, they currently own Converse, and that's an opportunity, or what they currently have. But if you look at the past, they've had Umbro, they've had Cole Haan, so they've had a lot of different brands, and they don't have a ton otherwise.
Did they acquire LA Gear back in the day? You guys remember LA Gear?
Wow.
Is that what a brand that was at one point? I wonder if that kind of fell apart and Nike swooped that up. I don't know. Anyway.
Okay, I've got one from Andres Oliveira. Hopefully I didn't totally butcher that, although I probably did. We might see some fashion brands step over to the trail category with some high-end collabs and products. I have another comment about this from a couple more. Someone else had something related to that. Better integration of gadgets, watch plus platform, all in one platform where you could use it to get instant feedback by AI, and then cooling systems integrated into shirts, running vests, gloves, and caps. Interesting.
We did see the cooling systems come into play, and these headbands that Kipchoge and others have been wearing. I wonder if we see more of that. The thing that perked my interest the most was the better integration of gadgets. I think that does all start to come together. I think what Aura Ring is doing, and the wellness angle into gadgets versus the performance and tracking, of times and things. I think that angle really grows because I think the consumer is looking to these activities more from that angle than from a performance angle, increasingly over time.
Yeah, and there was recently Dexcom invested in Aura. Dexcom makes the continuous glucose monitor, which having worked
Wouldn't that be wild?
having worked for a company previously that made continuous glucose monitors and also worked for Aura back in the day, I've actually tested the two, and you can see immediate connection between the data of your glucose and your sleep and everything else. So there's actually a big unlock that I think could come out of that if it's done appropriately. And I think too, there's so many different options that you have out there to track this and track that. And I think everybody's just sort of a little tired of that, and they just want just tell me what to do, And so if you can optimize by putting it all together in one dashboard that's like, here's what you need to do today, here's how you get to that point, instead of, I think a lot of us have a hard time pulling data together to be like, how does this impact that? Do these two cancel each other out? What am I supposed to do here? The easier a brand can make that for a person to just have one thing to help them go in the right direction so they don't have decision fatigue, or paralysis by analysis, as they call it. I think there's something really big to unlock there that still I think hasn't happened. So.
Yeah. What is continuous glucose monitoring like on your wrist? What does that do to race performance when you're just like, oh, I need to take a gel, like literally right now? Does that just eliminate bonking? I don't know. That really gets my mind going.
Yeah. I mean, it's actually banned from the UCI for road racing. And in fact, there was a brand called Super Sapiens that sponsored the Tour, I think, one year. And then they like immediately were like, nope, this is like, it was like too much of a competitive advantage from the way I understand it. So yeah, if you can monitor that and then supplement your glucose accordingly, it's like a huge
Game
lever.
Yeah.
So there's a reason. I'm actually Kipchoge is sponsored by Abbott, the company that I used to work for, and he uses it for training and racing and stuff because you get a level of data that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get anywhere else.
Yeah, that's a good one for this year.
Okay, Matt, this one is specifically calling you out. Ming, who's been a huge supporter, she actually writes Ming does the book list. So every time we mention a book in the podcast, there's something in the outdoors reading list. So big shout out to Ming for all the assists with this. Calls out your Substack specifically. We'll see more brands start collaborating with athletes and influencers, and more athletes, influencers starting to create their own content or brands specifically. I love this idea of athletes and their own brands. I feel like we meant to touch on this a little bit deeper in this pod, but we didn't really get to it.
I think that's coming. I don't know that that's coming this year. I think we need to see the brand being built up through content a bit more first. And like we've touched on, not in your depth, Lutzi, but a couple times in this conversation, we start to see that this year. But I think then actually building the brand as far as having products, I think we start to see that a bit later, but that's absolutely coming, and things are trending that direction for sure. And there's going to be a lot of money to be made by creators in that way. You see it outside of sports, I think, a bit, in fashion already, but that's coming here too.
It's, we were talking about before we recorded how, is it like a Jordan brand? Like I look at Normal with Killian, and that feels more Jordan-esque. Where I know Speedland does signature shoes for each one of the releases is basically supported by an athlete. But I do think there's something here that's got a little bit more of like a prime Logan Paul KSI kind of approach to it, where they're the face of the actual brand itself, but they're involved in a way. And I do think Normal is probably the closest to that right now, but I still think there's more to be done to draw that connection even closer, where we know that, Normal has like a team behind it that's doing it. And I think with Prime or Feastables or some of these other creator-led brands, you don't necessarily see that side of it. I mean, I don't believe that Mr. Beast is in a chocolate factory at any point, like pouring chocolate into molds, but he really is the face of the whole thing. And I'm really curious to see this develop. And I think you're right. It might start in 25, and then 26 we might actually see this.
Yeah, I kind of think of it like phases.
Yeah.
Currently, we've been in this phase of athletes are with brands, and their product is through that brand and is expressed through it. And I think of like the Sabrina shoe is the number 2 shoe in the WNBA at the moment, and that's amazing. But that's a great example of a big brand having an athlete signature as part of it. I think we're now in this phase of athletes are now connecting with brands, but it's almost their brand. And I think the Normal is a good example of that, where it's a separate brand than Camper, right? Like it's its own entity, but they still need the expertise that a brand brings of actually how do you manufacture, bring it here, distribute it, etc. And then I think, again, Trappe, I think you're spot on. I think we're going to continue to see pushes in that zone for the next 12 to 18 months. Yeah. But you're going to see people try a little bit harder. I think Asesh being a great example of that too, of actually having their own brand and coming to market. And I hope it's not too early for them, but I think they're going to learn a lot, and they're going to be a great sort of entry point to show that this can actually happen and you can actually run it. Especially we go back to that earlier trend of you've got agencies or people that are out there that can help you bring that to life. And it's never been easier to connect with them. I think that's going to be that 3-phased approach that we're going to see.
I think it's product dependent too, how you see it done. I think Camper and Normal works really well because footwear, if your product is footwear, is very capital intensive up front versus if this is apparel. And so you start to see that play out in different ways. And Camper really provides the back end that Normal needs. And to my knowledge, Seish is going about it a bit differently. I don't know that they have that infrastructure and that capital backing. It's kind of a slower churn, which isn't necessarily bad, but a lot of brands have grown that way. But there's a couple ways to go about it.
And it's so hard to start footwear first. Exactly. Like footwear is such a challenge to create, produce. It's much more complicated than apparel. Apparel's cheaper, it's faster, it's bought more rapidly. So you've got a higher frequency of purchase of a lower cost item, which is really helpful. But I do think it's going to be interesting to see where they start.
I think the adoption curve is going to mirror the content adoption curve, where athletes on the early side of it figured it out early and had a running start. They had a competitive advantage because they were early movers. Then more athletes started to figure it out and started to test and try. And now it's like a little bit more distributed, right? Where probably the same thing. There's going to be a couple athletes that test it out and try. Somebody's going to have like a big exit or a big moment. Like the reason why people are even talking about this at all is because Prime and Feastables are absolutely monsters in like a year or two. They've shot up to a crazy level so immediately. And if they had failed, if they hadn't gotten traction out of the gate, I don't think we'd be talking about this. So I think it's got to happen with an athlete where, you know, Allison Felix's brand has got to get acquired for like $1 billion or something. And then everybody's gonna be like, whoa, oh, this is actually a viable path forward. And I don't think in sports we've had, I'm probably wrong, but I don't think there's been someone who's done this exactly and had it really work out in a meaningful way. And I think until that happens, it's probably going to be slower adoption, but somebody's going to get it. And I hope it's one of us.
I think so. But Feastables and Prime, like these are like, there's not a lot of differentiators for those products versus like footwear. Like footwear has to be good. Like Feastables, my kids are obsessed with it. It's just a chocolate bar. There's nothing wildly crazy about it, but they really nailed distribution, right? And their marketing is totally on point, and they've capitalized on the audience. And that's one way to do it. I don't think that works for footwear. So it just depends on the product, like so much, and how you go about it. And we've seen it be successful without having to have that innovation and like product differentiator angle. I don't think.
The nuance too is that Logan Paul, KSI, Mr. Beast, they were getting to the point where brands could not afford to pay for an integration on their channel because the audience was so big, and the value was actually there, but just they were running in a smaller and smaller pool of people who could potentially even afford to work with them. And so they have all this value, but they can't find a home. I mean, imagine every single video that Mr. Beast puts out gets more views than the Super Bowl. So you have to be able to afford a Super Bowl ad to show up in this thing. There's a ton of value there, but it's also really expensive, which is just a consideration. And so why not put your own brand in there, continue delivering that value, but do it on something that you actually get a piece of the bottom line on. That's where it gets interesting. And right now, I think in sports, there's not a situation like that yet. But when it comes to be, that will be really interesting for whoever's able to capitalize on it. I think that's where it gets really interesting. Not saying that an athlete that's sort of like on their way up couldn't do it now, but I think where it becomes interesting, where you're able to afford to build a team to help you do it, that's where that inflection point probably occurs. Okay, I got to keep it moving here. We got a couple to go. Tom Dillon says, I'm sure the Skims and TNF collab will send a signal to other performance brands and lifestyle brands. There's plenty of room to collab and crossover, and I expect we'll see more of that.
I agree. I mean, I think those are good plays for brands that have sort of hit the ceiling maybe in the outdoor world and are trying to expand into other areas. But there's sacrifices to be made there. Like Kyle Frost's article hit on, Skims and the North Face and how this just falls completely outside of any sustainability goals for the North Face, because Skims has just an abysmal record there. I think you'll see these large scale ones, but only in specific situations. I think we see a lot more on the smaller scale collabs, and I'm excited about those because they just feel more authentic and a bit less self-serving for me.
Okay, Thomas Watson says, one I just called out in the running space for an upcoming piece for the Marathon Handbook is optimization fatigue. With so much innovation around tracking performance, sleep, etc., and AI tools to guide your training, not to mention super shoes, there's never been more products available to optimize your performance. But at the same time, the stuff puts pressure on the runner to perform, when for many of us, running isn't about performing, but maybe more of an outlet for something else. So I think in tandem with these new performance-led innovations, we're going to see a swing toward running for fun, the continued boom of run clubs, more people doing running events and not caring about their finishing times, runners hiring old-fashioned human running coaches.
Yeah, I would agree. I think I go back to one of the things we're seeing now is health and wellness has become toxic. And that's sort of, if you go back 3 years, I would sort of look at this and say, all right, like there's too much noise that's in there. And I think you're now seeing that sort of optimization is creating that toxicity. And when you push too far in one direction, you're going to get the counter that goes back across. And I think people are going to say, hey, like, let's go back to foundations. And it honestly takes us, Matt, right back to the top of the conversation, that people are just going to find their unique reason for doing it. And it's going to be outside of necessarily performance all the time. It's going to be about mental wellness. It's going to be about fun. It's going to be about being with friends. And so I do think that's a trend that we're going to continue to see.
I couldn't have written this better, Thomas Watson. I think you absolutely nailed it. It speaks to me perfectly. I'm signed up for 50 miles in May. I'm pacing my friend Mike Wardian at Hard Rock this year. Both daunting physical tasks, but I have no performance goals other than to keep up with Mike at Hard Rock. And I just completely fall into this category. So yay for the lifestyle component of these sports.
Okay, Mitchell Atakova says Natural Selection expanding their events to more sports. If you're not familiar with Natural Selection, they do a surf, a mountain bike, a snowboard, and I think a ski. And we interviewed Todd Barber, who does the mountain bike one. But basically, Natural Selection started off as a really innovative snowboard event that was sort of the best of the best coming together to compete in the backcountry. And they then got into mountain biking, and now they're launching in the next couple months with kind of this world tour with a handful of different sports. So Mitchell is saying like this format could work where there's like a world tour for all kinds of different sports to kind of pull everybody together. This could be really interesting from how does Natural Selection Tour develop as a specific brand that brings content together for all the sports that you like? We're talking to Mel Strong, and she's like, there is no such thing as an action sports consumer. No one wakes up in the morning and is like, I can't wait to go do action sports. But I do think that there is a mindset within people that exist in all of those different individual verticals that we love to see people pushing the boundaries. I genuinely don't really know much about surf, but I would love to see footage of somebody surfing that giant wave in Portugal, for example. Like, I just love the idea of people pushing their boundaries. And I think that if Natural Selection can really focus in on their core offering, which is probably that more than the technicality of whatever the first place person did, if they can translate that to a wider audience, I think they have a really interesting brand growing, similar to what Nitro Circus did.
Are there parallels to what Outside is doing, sort of trying to aggregate different outlets from different verticals thinking there'll be one place where people can go and get all this information. Does that, I don't know that, I mean, I'm paralleling the models here. I don't know if that's correct. I'm trying to understand. Not familiar with natural selection, so I could be off, but I think the nichification is really the theme. And I don't know that the aggregation across verticals, I don't know that that works, at least at the moment.
I think it really does come down to understanding who is watching, like who is the viewer. And if I'm critical of outside, I don't know, like we've been talking about, like where is the heavy enthusiast in this story? I feel like people that are using Map My Run are probably more on the casual side.
Yeah.
And so trying to serve heavy enthusiast content to casual consumers is probably a miss, if I'm honest. Where I think that what natural selection is doing is really targeting, hey, we found the people who are the most excited about pushing limits, and whether they like surfing or skiing or snowboarding or mountain biking, they can at least appreciate that. Like the 8 million plus people that watch Red Bull Rampage.
Yeah.
What percentage of those people actually would even want to go to Utah to ride mountain bikes there? So I think like if they can get to that point and they can establish a brand around that, that could be interesting. To Mitchell's point about expanding beyond what they've already got, I would advise against that, at least until they get natural selection to really mean something beyond just like this one-off snowboard event, this one-off mountain bike event. But I do think, as a 10-year plan, that might be a really interesting way to think about it and how to grow it and develop the actual brand of like, this is people pushing limits. I think that's where you have to kind of come back to.
Yeah.
I missed this one because it was like actually a response to Ming's post, but Jonathan Levitt said, Puma makes a splash in trails. So you guys were both at TRE. You saw Puma's booth probably. Thoughts? Do you agree, disagree?
I don't see that coming in this next year. Just a disagree there. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't see that coming.
Yeah, trail would be where the step too far. I do think it looks to me, they seem well positioned in order to gain ground and road.
I agree.
But trail is a little bit of a stretch.
Yeah, I agree.
Does it look like there is at least motion in that direction? It does seem like a lot of brands are starting to explore the trail running space a little bit more. So do you think Puma at least has a route to get there?
I feel like you start to see athletes work with these brands before you see the products come out, because then they work with the athletes to develop the products. And on the trail side, I haven't seen the athletes partner with Puma unless something's about to drop. Meaning I don't expect some imminent product to come out this next year, and so I don't see that in the short term.
Watch this space. I mean, maybe Jonathan knows something that we don't.
Absolutely. Entirely possible.
Which could be really, maybe we just got like we just got an exclusive on Second Nature.
Yeah, right.
Watch this space. I mean, Puma's done some really interesting stuff. The Brianna Stewart collab over the last couple of years has been really fascinating in the basketball space. They've done some really great stuff with her. So it's not like they haven't gone into new territory and done interesting things. So
let's do it.
Yeah, but as a brand, I love, back to your point, going into the Olympics and like where you're headed in the next 4 years, like road is such a good space for them, and track. Like if they can gain that space and that momentum now, and it ends up being a showdown between countries, seems like a good runway for them.
Puma did great, at least from the U.S. perspective. They did great on the women's side, with athletes qualifying for the U.S. Olympic team in the marathon this past cycle. Yeah. I would absolutely run with that. I think they're really set up there.
Agreed. Cool.
This is the thing that always happens where we finish a podcast and you're like, I forgot to say whatever, but we got time. Let's talk about this lightning round. We missed some spicy takes, guys, and we finished recording the podcast and we realized that we missed a lot of topics. This is already the longest running podcast we've ever done. So let's just add a couple more minutes worth of stuff here, because there's so much that we didn't even get through. Steve, dads as the brand killers. Just go.
Yeah, I feel like this is bloopers. You ready? So dads are going to be brand killers in 2025. And so here's my take. I'm seeing a lot of dads wearing a lot of different brands. And I think it's going to they're going to tank some of these brands that are out there, is a hot take. And I think you saw it with moms, with Stanley's. And I think you're going to see the same thing with a couple of the brands that we're seeing out there. in 2025.
Some brands got to go out there and do like okay, we're going to recruit a bunch of dads to basically boycott our brand.
Yeah.
That's like the key to success.
Recruit dads to your competitor brands. And
Yeah,
just
totally.
ruin them.
Oh, could you imagine if somebody did that? Like, hey, we represent this brand. No, really. And we want you to like do a bunch of content. Like, imagine like the anti-marketing approach.
Counter marketing.
That's really fascinating.
My 8th grade daughter sees me in things, and there's absolutely some truth to this, because there's an eye roll and then she won't be caught dead in it.
That's 2025. And that's always been the case. But there are a couple brands that are really winning with the dads at the moment that I think they're gonna struggle. I'm not gonna name them. They know who they are. Hopefully they know who they are.
So cool. Okay, we had some other hot topics that we want to talk through.
Yeah.
I know we had, we really didn't talk a lot about the athletes themselves. And so like women in sport had an absolute banner year in 2024. Trappe, what do you think is the future and what can we expect in 2025?
I think we see it continue. I think you see more women throw down incredible performances and compete with the men. I'm talking on the running side, in trail specifically. I think you see more excitement around it. I think that leads to more brands and more products specifically for women. And I'm really bullish on this. I want to see it continue. And I think we do. I think there's a huge opportunity business-wise that you can justify in a boardroom. And I think you see the excitement out on the street.
I do too. I would build on that. I think 2024 was about organic growth, which is amazing. Yeah. I think it's going to now actually, some of it's going to need to be created in 2025. There needs to be some great energy that comes, because you're not getting the same rookies that you were getting in last year and rookie performances. How do you manufacture that a little bit more is going to be really important. But I agree. I want this to win.
Yeah, let's go.
We've referenced this on a couple previous pods, but there was a study called the Fame Gap, and it was talking about how like specific individual female athletes absolutely raised an entire sport. Right. And we've had more than a few insane examples. What was the most recent one that Caitlin Clark is responsible for like, what is it, like 50% of all ticket sales or something like that in the WNBA? I mean, there are some really interesting statistics that like women have this superpower when it comes to marketing and raising an entire sport. One of the things that really stood out to me, my first ever meeting with the global team at Red Bull, the athlete marketing team, the head of athletes stood up and said, our women athletes have the highest ROI of any marketing thing that we do. And I think it was, in context, it's really interesting, because if I'm honest, every single female athlete I worked with, like the bar was just higher, right? They all were world champions. Every single woman that I worked with when I inherited the roster was a world champion. And so like the stakes and the requirements were so crazy high to be a sponsored athlete. I think that's sort of softened up a little bit, where people are really finding their way to like become professionals, become sponsored without having to be world champions, which is great overall. But I do think there's something really interesting to tap into. And you're right, Steve, like having brands that are able to continue to pour fuel on the fire when it comes to telling their stories, to really, getting the most out of those athletes and really helping put them in that position to be successful. There's more opportunity there than there ever has been, I think.
Yeah.
I saw a stat that Sabrina Ionescu's shoe with Nike was not only one of the most worn shoes in the WNBA, but also in the NBA. And so I think if you see that crossover where the men are looking to the women's products, like that's really the next level that brings it more on par with the men's products that women have had to wear for so long. And that would just be really cool to see.
I love that.
Very cool.
All right, another take. Hybrid athletes are going to continue to evolve. So if you think of hybrid athletes as like runners meet lifters, they've gone from CrossFit. They've sort of moved into this lifting heavy and potentially a bit of trail. But the whole Peter Attia lift heavy, I think that's the most common one you see out there. I think Hyrox is going to make a mark in 2025. I think it's going to create this sort of endurance athlete lifting, and it's going to bring back that let's call it a JV version of CrossFit, where it's not as heavy and not as extreme, but it's going to be a little bit more accessible. It's going to give people an opportunity to lift and to run, but also compete. And so I see that coming on the market.
Do you think High Rocks has an entry level side to it? Because every single person I see competing in High Rocks or anything related to High Rocks is like a specimen. And so like I don't know if I would ever go to a High Rocks thing. I'm in decent shape and I do lift heavy and I do have good endurance, but like I'm terrified. I feel like what comes out of High Rocks is just so, it looks elite, whereas I feel like CrossFit gyms, there was a lot more of a community aspect in the whole thing.
Exactly. I think that's going to be their barrier to entry, is like, if they stay in this elite side, they're going to potentially lose. It's going to be a fast trend that sort of plays out. They're going to have to make it accessible to everybody. And so everybody gets to play and everybody toes the same line, the same way you do in running. But just some are faster than others, then great. And so I think the way to do that is to mix. When you see those videos of the pros, I want to see, one of my friends right next to them, like huffing and puffing, right? Like, it's, if you can combine them together and say, hey, everybody's in the same place, then I think you're set up for win.
Any other hot takes that you want to throw in before we wrap this up?
I'm gonna bring up NIL, and I have got a hot take there. I think Parker Valby signing, eschewing Nike to sign for New Balance. I wonder if this starts to make NIL more of a play for, marketing to the younger, say, runner or younger athlete, instead of really building equity with those top elite athletes before they really turn pro. Because I think, like we saw Parker completely switch, I don't think that angle is working. And NIL's pretty new. We're starting to see how that might shake out. I think that's one way it's starting to shake out.
I think there's definitely a little bit of a split when it comes to NIL too, where originally it seemed like everybody was going to get deals. Yes. The linemen from the local football team were all going to get sponsored, and it was going to be this huge thing. I think it still is pretty heavily weighted toward the high performers, who it's just a chance for them to get, engaged, and a chance for them to start building equity with brands and, start getting their chops up before they're full-time paid like they're going to. Like, I don't think there's anybody who wasn't already going to turn pro or wasn't going to have a successful career. Maybe they're a content creator that's in college or whatever that also plays a sport, but I don't think there's anybody who wasn't going to be successful who somehow got saved by NIL and somehow built a career off that. I think you already had to be tracking in the right direction, whether it's content or performance, to get those deals to begin with, where the initial vibe with NIL was like, oh, now everybody on the team can get paid. And I just don't think the value is there for brands, and no one's really figured out the volume way to use that across 500 athletes yet either.
Yeah, I agree. I think we start to see that shake out a little bit more. It's had a bit of time to mature, right? And the experimentation stage is maybe just maturing a bit.
I think we've done a decent job of coverage. We got some spicy takes in there. Dad's killing brands. I mean, wow.
Watch. I'm telling you.
I'll single-handedly do it.
I gotta be careful what I'm choosing to wear.
Yeah, right.
No, exactly.
It's nice having a teenager in the house, though. They keep you honest. You kind of know where you stand, and that's valuable.
Okay, I'm gonna bring this episode to a close with one final little bonus prediction for 2025. I think that Second Nature is going to pick up steam and potentially monetize in 2025. We've been doing this all for the love up until this point.
Let's go.
A lot of time and effort goes into every single one of the episodes, to the newsletter, to the Slack channel, to the YouTube. And I absolutely love what we get to do here. And the feedback this year, I mean, definitely highlight of my year. We started this thing in April, and holy smokes, as Dylan would say, it's come a long, long way. And the guests that we have on today and we've had on in especially the last couple of weeks, have just been bonkers. I think things only get more interesting in 2025. And I want to leave on a galaxy brain idea that I have for monetization, because I think when it comes to podcasts, advertising, ad reads are sort of the standard fare, and or having to pay for access to additional content, which we're already putting out 2 episodes a week. I'm not looking to do a third at this point. But what I think might be a really interesting way to sort of monetize or bring value to brands and our audience at the same time, which is sort of like the filter that I want to kind of circle around, is this kind of idea around how do we make Galaxy Brain something really interesting and valuable to brands. So the Galaxy Brain concept, if you've heard any other podcasts from us, is always like this big idea, how you might approach something from a different angle, what you might do to take something forward. And while it might not make sense for a brand to come in and advertise with us for a year or for a quarter or whatever, it might make sense for them to come and give us something to riff on for an episode. So imagine X brand comes in and says, hey, we want to get into trail running. We want to get into mountain biking. Riff on what it would look like for, let's say, the North Face to get into mountain biking in 2025. We're going to sponsor this episode and let you guys just go to town. Or, hey, we have a new athlete signing and we want to figure out how to activate them. Can you guys give us a Galaxy Brain episode on what that might look like? And so I think there's like value for the audience to like listen to us work it out and bring in some people to talk about it. But also there's a ton of value for the brand who can then go and immediately action that and move forward with it. So that's my Galaxy Brain for monetizing Second Nature in 2025, but open to anybody else's opinion.
I love that, Lucy. That's a lot of some of the feedback I get from brands on my own Substack is, hey, can we have a call and just brainstorm on this particular topic? So I think they're looking for that, particularly smaller brands that are really still trying to figure a lot out. And I think that's a great idea. I'd love to participate in some of those. Yes. We have to figure out the monetization angle.
Yeah. And, we're kind of kicking around some ideas on the brand camp as well, but that's going to take a pretty heavy lift, whereas we're already doing Galaxy Brain. I said on a recent pod that I've got more ideas than time. So if I can share some of those in a way that's meaningfully beneficial to the success of the podcast and, everything, and to the brands themselves, then I feel like that'd be a really fun way to kind of approach it while still bringing a lot of value to the people that are listening, which we super appreciate everybody that's been with us all year. And honestly, I'm just so excited for next year. The conversations we're going to unlock. I've been learning so much from everybody that we've had on the podcast. So selfishly, I just really like, getting a chance to be in the room with everybody.
Yes.
But yeah, it's been a good year.
Well, it's been great. I've been listening since episode 1, and you really just hit on the conversations I was wanting to have anyway. So any way I can support you keeping it going, let's do it. But yeah, look at all those monetization angles. You can go from the sponsorship, or you can, go with the membership, or there's a lot of different strategies to do it. And that depends on what you're going for.
Onwards and upwards in 2025. You're all stuck with us. We're not going
time to unleash 2025.
Yeah. Well, this episode I think is going to come out on December 31st. So it'll either be the last episode people hear in 2024 or the first one they hear in 2025. But either way, thank you guys for being on the pod today. This was such a fun conversation, and let's see. We're going to have to do a recap pod at the end of 25 to see what actually came through.
Let's do it.
Hopefully it went out wrong already by the time this comes out. That would be a swing and a miss. Thank you guys. This is a blast. I look forward to talking more soon.
Absolutely.
Thanks.